Hi, this is Brother Logan M. Isaac, and in this video I'm going to talk about Representative Mike Levin's history with the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment and Assistance Act of 1974, which is supposed to protect veterans from employment discrimination. However, Mike Levin has been avoiding the topic and therefore creating an environment in which employers have free rein on discriminating and harassing veterans. So the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment and Assistance Act, or VEVRA for short, is in fact Title 38, Section 4212 of the United States Code. And in particular, there's one subsection that I'm interested in, which deals with the reports that the Secretary of Labor is supposed to send Congress. And specifically, Mike Levin's, the subcommittee that Mike Levin chairs on economic opportunity within the House VA committee. So these reports in subsection C are required to include the number of complaints filed by veterans under VEVRA, the actions taken thereon, and the resolutions thereof. On the left, I've repeated what you can see, but it's hard to see there on the right. And this is just one part of VEVRA. This is the reporting requirement of VEVRA and the complaints that veterans are allowed to file. And so in these reports, they go back to, 2004 or something. But just as a snapshot, here are some of the relevant lines within the reports starting in 2012. And you can see in the blue, I provided links if you want to look these up, or you could go to dol.gov and search the Veterans Employment and Training Service website, VETS, for these reports that come out every year. And in 2012, you can see that there's just this kind of standard line. And every year they make this report, and there's this one line. In 2012, there were 66 complaints. 2013, there were 53, and on through 14 through 18, there were 45, 54, 53. And then 2017, there was a big jump. I don't know why. And then 2018, there were 132 complaints. And I'm going to stop at 2018 because in January of 2019, Representative Mike Levin was sworn into the House of Representatives, and he represents Camp Pendleton with its Marines, as well as San Clemente, Oceanside, which are both heavily concentrated veteran populations. And he assumed the subcommittee chairmanship from the beginning of his tenure. And it's important to point out that Mike Levin and Mark Takano, the full committee chair, neither of them have served in the military, but they hold power over this massive, federal agency, the VA, and it's, as you can see, and I've highlighted in a screenshot to the right, to include legislative oversight and investigative jurisdiction over the education of veterans, employment and training of veterans, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what this subcommittee is required to be watching for and watching over. And so I imagine that of all the subcommittees in the VA, the DOL reports that we just saw go probably to Levin's subcommittee, if not just to Takano. I'm not sure. But as a economic opportunity subcommittee, it seems like that would be within his purview. And so in 2019, I was living near D.C., and I approached Mike Levin's office because I knew that he was the chair of the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity in the House VA Committee. And on May 14th, I alerted one of his staff members, Faith Williams, after I'd met with her in person in April. I had noticed that these reports only include the numbers of the complaints, not the actions or the resolutions. And so I began asking these questions to the subcommittee chair and his staff. After I met with her and I sent this email, she said that she would have the committee look at it. You can see she responded within a day. And then several days later, I still hadn't heard anything. And so I followed up on May 20th. Then I had discovered that Mike Levin was going to be on a panel with Brad Wenstrup of Ohio, put on by the American Enterprise Institute on the subject of veterans issues. And they were there to talk about this thing, the Veteran Opportunity Act, which would be a fourth administration or something. And I told Faith and other staff members that I would be there and I would ask questions about the reports and some other things going on, and this is what I had to say. Before any fourth administration stands up under the Vet Op Act, would you be willing and able to hold a hearing underneath in your committee, the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee under HVAC, to look into how to consolidate and expand and strengthen those civil rights that do exist under for soldiers and veterans? And secondly, would either of you or both of you be willing to sign letters, open letters to federal agencies holding into account for those civil rights laws for soldiers and veterans that they are not enforcing or do not seem to know about?
Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for your service and for asking that. I'd be happy to work with our committee staff and talk about the hearing schedule that we have coming up. I know we have a August field hearing, and then I'm sure we'll have plenty more opportunities throughout the session, and I'd be happy to work with you. And somewhere in here is Faith Williams from my personal office, so she is in the back. I don't think Justin is here from HVAC, who kind of helps manage the calendar, but we'd be happy to speak with you about that because I think it's an important concern, and I'm sure that you would love having a hearing on implementation of the Vet Op Act. The second question, I'd be happy to look at that, and if you could circle up with Faith before we go this morning, I'd be happy to follow up.
So that was what he had to say live on C-SPAN in July of 2019. And as before, I didn't hear much from him, and the fiscal year report for that year followed the same pattern as before, which you can see here. This is the report, the fiscal year report for 2019, with, again, the URL right below it. And on the right, I've highlighted straight out of the congressional record 38 U.S. Code Section 4212C, and this statement of compliance on page 5 of the congressional report, which claims that it's in compliance with 4212C, but as you can see at the bottom on page 20, again, it only mentions the number of complaints. It says nothing about the actions or the resolutions of the complaints. So again, not compliant with federal law, or it's not compliant. It's missing these two pieces of information. So after that panel, I reached out and continued to reach out to Mike Levin's office asking him about a hearing, because I think that veterans employment discrimination deserves the attention of Congress and the American public for reasons I'll get into shortly. So I emailed his office again in November, following up about the promises made on C-SPAN. I emailed them again on December 6th, the same subject about the House Veterans Affairs Committee Equal Economic Opportunity hearing, and I heard nothing. And you'll recognize from the video, the woman in red there is his staffer, Faith Williams, the military legislative assistant, who, as far as I know, has no military experience. I don't know for sure. I don't know her story. So it sure appears as though he's ignored it, but he's been made aware that there's a problem with the reports, and he seems to be sitting on it. So COVID hits, everybody gets locked down, and eventually, I believe in August of 2021, the fiscal year 2020 congressional report is put out by the Department of Labor's Veterans Education and Training Services Agency. In the meantime, between after the AEI panel and this report being published, I had been in contact with William Torrens, the compliance director at the Department of Labor, as well as the chief investigator, Robert Shepard, at the Department of Labor, and it quickly turned kind of adversarial because I pointed out the agency that they head is responsible for these reports, and it is missing this information. And so, miraculously, fiscal year 2020 congressional report did in fact become compliant with VEVRA. You can see that they included a table on page 18 that includes what seems to be the number, the actions, and the resolutions of the complaints by veterans. And it seemed like a big win. And in fact, page 4, the introduction, was correct in stating that they were in compliance with 4212C. And I was satisfied. I was happy. I was expecting that this would continue to be the pattern. However, just a few weeks before recording this video, um, I only noticed it a couple of days after Election Day when my family had moved back to California. The fiscal year 2021 report came out. And on page 5, as is the pattern, they claim to be in compliance with 4212C. But then on page 28, um, it doesn't just go back to the old pattern of just having the numbers. Everything that would be required under subsection C has been omitted. There's no report on the number of complaints. There's no report or information on the action of complaints, and there's no information on the resolution of complaints. Given that Levin's office has known about this and has said that they'd be interested in a hearing, it sure seems that Mike Levin's office is accepting false vets reports on behalf of Congress or Mark Takano. I don't know. I don't know how those things work. But Levin certainly knew because I've been pointing it out. And that kind of frustrated me because I'd seen success and then it had been taken away. Now, why is this important, right? It's just congressional reports. It's going to get lost in, wonky policy, head junkies, whatever. But what's important is what that data that is supposed to be reported actually discloses. And here is what that data would say. Now, recently, just yesterday, I've actually re-recorded this video because I found a website, a web page on the Department of Labor's website that has only existed since September 27th, 2021. And if you'll recall, that is when the report was compliant, and they published FOIA data that I had asked for going back to the year 2000, fiscal year 2000. And in that data, over the course of 21 years, and you can go to the URL there at the bottom you can click on complaint investigations yourself and get the exact same CSV file that I'm working off of. And in that data, you can find out for yourself that veterans making complaints of employment discrimination under VEVRA make up the Department of Labor's largest enforcement caseload. There are more veterans making complaints of employment discrimination and turning to the DOL for support than any other complainants protected by any other statute that they enforce. Something like 820 veterans over 21 years. That same data also gives you the violation information. So if a veteran complains, the DOL will then process the complaint, investigate, and then they will send back their report, their findings. And if they find a violation, that's called a finding of merit. Your complaint had merit. The employer was discriminating against you, harassing you, fill in the blank, whatever. And in that data, you can break it down between different statutes, and you can find out which statutes and which complainants are receiving findings of merit, are being told that their complaints are true and there is a violation. Veterans are being denied access to economic opportunity as much as 2 times as other statutes. You can see that veterans and VEVRA are well below the agency's average of about 11 complaints out of 100 returning findings of merit, and it's the lowest of any of the statutes that the DOL has jurisdiction over. So veterans are being denied at far greater rates, even while they make up the largest caseload. So this is a clear-cut, data-supported instance of veterans not being believed when they come forward with allegations of employment discrimination. And I know all this, and I became interested in all this because I was one of those veterans. You can find my complaint in that data set. If you look in 2016, it was against Duke University. OFCCP, Office of Federal Contracts Compliance Program, which is the enforcement arm of the DOL. I opened a case with them on September 13th, 2016. And what had happened was I had been teaching there as a teaching assistant, and I was given an evening teaching position, and I was given half the number of students as every other teaching assistant in my course, and that I knew of at all in the school that I was teaching at the university. And I wouldn't have said anything were it for the fact, or were it not for the fact that the time in the evening that I was given to teach, my partner and I had just learned that we would be new parents, and that was going to be bedtime. And I was nervous about going to my hiring manager because I knew her. She was a student when I was a student, and she had a really bad reputation. And I didn't want to ask her for something and then either her hold it over my head or take a contract from me because I was more trouble than I was worth. So I went to my dean. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happened that was just a snowball that had been thrown over the edge of a snowy mountain. And I first spoke internally at Duke's Office of Institutional Equity. That fell apart and was humiliating and dehumanizing. And I finally filed with the DOL in September saying that I believe I was being treated differently, not because I wasn't qualified, but because I was a veteran, and people have all kinds of assumptions about what being a veteran means. And I learned after the internal report from Duke came out, I learned that my hiring manager didn't even know that I had had 5 semesters of teaching experience. I had published academic articles, presented at conferences. None of that mattered. She didn't even know that I had teaching experience, which means she didn't read my resume. And so as an example of how easy it is to get back past the DOL, Duke University, as I've said, they went under investigation in September of 16 when I filed. And it just happens that when I filed, there was a harassment policy on the books that had been last updated a couple months before I filed, in June, I think, of 2016. And harassment was one of several issues that I brought before the DOL in the process of my complaint. And then when I filed on September 13th, that put them, Duke University, under federal investigation, one they fought with the help of an anti-labor law firm that I can't remember the name of right now. And then, 2 months into this investigation by the Department of Labor, they quietly updated the harassment policy to include veteran status. The only change they made to their harassment policy on November 7th, 2016. Just 2 months after being placed under investigation, they altered documentary material while they were under investigation by a federal agency, which seems to be obstruction of justice or some that doesn't seem to be right. And I brought this to the attention of the Solicitor General, requested an appeal when I was told that my complaint lacked sufficient evidence, and at every turn I got denied. And it seemed difficult to believe that the amount of evidence that I gave them was not enough. And that's how I started looking into how the law was written and why, and who else might have experienced this. And that's when I got involved in 16, and as I became a young father, I began applying my research training to the congressional record, to federal law, reading court documents and everything else. And so when I approached Mike Levin and his office as a subcommittee chair on economic opportunity, I thought that they could help. I thought they had a responsibility to help as a very powerful member of Congress, given my circumstances. And yet, despite almost 4 years of poking and prodding and pushing information, I got kind of sloughed off and ignored time and time and time again. So veteran employment discrimination is a problem, as the data makes very clear, and it doesn't appear to me to be true that it is not that it can be overlooked, and that it's not a problem that contributes to military suicide and veteran suicide. I think it is, but we'll only know that when we begin speaking about this openly, and we can't speak about this openly until responsible parties in Congress, in the press, and elsewhere actually look into the data and start asking why we don't realize this is a problem. Because the data is clear that it is a problem, and I think we need to be talking about it much more openly.